Who were the Canaanites?
All right. Um, Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land of Canaan, or modern day Israel, was populated by small clans of Canaanite inhabitants. And according to the biblical narrative, these um, clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally, and opposed God. And God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then he called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, "Drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death. And I am giving this land to you, to Israel." So they were the pre Israeli inhabitants of this region of the world, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
And as you say, the Old Testament makes it clear that God considered these people to be an immoral people, much in the same way that before the flood of Noah, we sort of have this pleading with God of saying, look, are there not any good people amongst this community? Are you really going to flood the entire world? Is there not one person worth saving? And as far as I know, most people defend God's action here by saying that the answer is no, that the society had become so corrupt that there wasn't any sort of salvageable morality. And I suppose something like that is going on with the Canaanites here. I suppose...
Yes. If I might comment, this is not simply biblically attested. I have a colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of ancient literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it is horrific, the culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practiced bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the biblical description doesn't go into that kind of morbid detail that these documents do.
I suppose I intuitively find it difficult to believe that there's not a single person in this community who is not so unsalvageably touched or consumed by sin in this way, that the actions we see the Israelites committing on the command of God can be justified. So to give people an idea, to give them the full picture, we've described who the Canaanites are, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about that, but the reason that this is a problem, the reason why Richard Dawkins is talking about these people, is because, as you say, God promises this land to the Israelites, and he waits 400 years and says this is because the sin sort of hasn't got bad enough yet, essentially. He says it will happen in 400 years because by that point things will be so bad that this will be sort of justifiably inflicted. But he commands the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. And the language used in the Bible is quite extreme in a few different areas, talking about completely destroying a city, leaving nothing alive that breathes. And on the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho, it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the
Right.
cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. If there was an innocent person among the adults, that person didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They were be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel, people will talk about coming to the land. That's how they refer to it. So, what God was doing was giving the land of Canaan from or to Israel and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of Canaan. And so they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
Right. We were talking about whether or not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of this action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God Himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey. So, what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he wills. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral uh, constraints that we do because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of internal inconsistency between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second in this case would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other because God wrongs no one in issuing such a command. And if he wrongs no one, then there is no moral constraint on his issuing such a command.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument for the existence of God, you might appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that to construct an argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Rouser points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. And as long as this ethical theory is possible and coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good and all loving and his issuing a command of this sort. In the absence of a divine command, as I say, it could well have been immoral. But given the presence of divine command, it becomes the moral obligation of those persons to whom it was issued.
Now,
So it doesn't undermine our moral intuitions about what's right and wrong. It just introduces the qualification of a divine command
but it would mean
that
that
can
there's
override
nothing
that.
there's nothing intrinsically wrong with taking the life of an innocent child. Nothing intrinsically wrong with doing that.
Well, again, this is going to depend on your moral theory, Alex. I think that right and wrong, moral obligations, are determined by imperatives issued by a qualified authority. And so, in the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right and wrong. It's a subjective illusion of human consciousness. And I think this is one of the real problems of atheism, is that lacking a moral lawgiver and moral authority, it has no basis for affirming objective right and wrong. These are just either patterns of behavior that have emerged from the sociobiological pressures of the evolutionary process, or else they're expressions of personal preference and taste. In neither case, then, are they normative. So, in the absence of a moral authority to issue these imperatives, there wouldn't be any objective right or wrong. But given such a divine moral lawgiver, there is objective right and wrong, but that moral lawgiver himself doesn't have the same moral obligations that we do.
To watch the full conversation, click the link that's on your screen. Subscribe to my main channel or this clip's channel by clicking just below it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.